Welcome back to my channel. Sally Anne Bowman was born to parents Linda and Paul in September 11th, 1987, and enjoyed a close and tight-knit relationship with her family. She was happy-go-lucky, incredibly friendly, and had a huge heart. She was also very mature for her age and wanted to work hard to support herself, so she made the big step to move out of the family home and live by herself in a rented room. Although she had moved out in her late teens, she still made sure to see her family as often as she could, and she would never go too long without meeting up with them. Bright and bubbly performing was a huge passion for Sally Anne. School for Performing Arts. The prestigious school boasts among its alumni actor Tom Holland and singers Adele and Amy Winehouse. For Sally Anne, getting into the selective and distinguished school was an incredible achievement and one more step towards her dreams. She also had a successful modeling career and took every opportunity that came her way. On the of September 2005, 18-year-old Sally Anne was staying at her mother's house. She spent the day relaxing, and then her sister Nicole rang and asked if she wanted to go out in the evening to celebrate the birthday of Nicole's best friend at around p.m. Sally Anne got ready and headed off. As she left, her mother told her she loved her, and Sally Anne said she loved her back and walked off down the driveway. She met up with her sister and friends and headed to one of their favorite spots in the center of town. She was caught on CCTV in the bar, laughing, dancing, and enjoying her girls' night out. As the night started to wind down, she left with sister Nicole and walked out into Croydon town center. Not long after, she began talking to her ex-boyfriend Louis Sproston on the phone. They had ended their relationship only a few weeks before, and Sally Anne desperately wanted to see him. She got a taxi from her sisters back into Croydon, where Louis met her in his car. He picked her up at around a.m. and drove her to her house in Blenheim Crescent, where she was renting a room. With the breakup being only a matter of weeks ago, emotions were still very raw, and soon into their journey the pair started arguing in the car. The argument went on until around a.m., and Sally Anne then got out of the car and Louis drove off. A witness said they were woken by the sound of a garbled noise ending with a scream. The witness then got out of bed and looked out of their window, but couldn't see anything. The air was still, and there was no other noise coming from the street. They returned to the window about 5 later and kept their lights off. They saw a man walking down the streets, but with no other noise and no one else around. They left the window and went back to bed. At around that morning, a neighbor went outside and saw what they assumed were the legs of a mannequin protruding from behind a builder's skip. After going over to investigate, they were met with a truly horrific sight. It was the body of Sally Anne Bowman. She was partially clothed, and it was clear that she was deceased. Police quickly arrived on scene and sealed off the area. The murder squad was called in, and an investigation swiftly got underway. This would become the largest investigation London had ever seen. Linda Bowman heard knocking at her front door. She said she assumed it was Sally Anne, and she had been locked out. As she opened the door, she was met with 3 police officers who asked her if she was Linda Bowman and if she knew Sally Anne. She explained that Sally Anne was her youngest daughter. The officer then told her the devastating news: her beloved child had been found stabbed to death. She said, "I just remember screaming, absolutely screaming. I just couldn't believe it. My whole world fell apart." Police then had to break the news to her sister, Michelle. Michelle said, "I remember something leaving me that day, and it's never ever come back." Within a few hours of the investigation being launched, her sister and mother were faced with a terrible ordeal of formally identifying her body. Michelle said, "I remember going into the room, and for a split I thought it wasn't her because her hair was dark, and I just moved forward and saw her little butter nose and her freckles, and that was it." Her devastated mother said she fell apart upon seeing Sally Anne's body, and Michelle was crying, "Please wake her up. Mom, please wake her up." 2 days after Sally Anne had been found, her family made the incredibly difficult decision to find out more from the police. Stuart Kunde went to Linda's house with other officers to talk the family through it. What happened in the few following Sally Anne getting out of Louis's vehicle remains unclear, but what investigators were able to piece together was that Sally Anne was standing alone in the driveway of her house, less than meters from the safety of her front door, when she was caught off guard in a frenzied and violent attack. During the attack, Sally Anne Bowman was stabbed at least 7 times, with 3 of the stab wounds being so strong they passed through her body. There was also evidence to suggest that she had been sexually assaulted. Postmortem had also been bitten several times, which had left DNA evidence. The peace and tranquility of this quiet suburban street had been shattered, and a sadistic, violent killer was now on the run. Her ex-boyfriend Lewis was quickly identified as a potential suspect, as he and Sally Anne had fought the night she was killed, and he had been one of the last people to see her alive. This was soon made a focus of the investigation. Officers quickly mobilized, and the hunt was now on to find Lewis Broston. He was soon located with his brother and a friend. He identified himself and was subsequently arrested and brought in for questioning over the next 4 days. The murder squad questioned Lewis and took samples of his DNA. He maintained he knew nothing about Sally Anne's murder until the police arrived to talk to him. His DNA sample was sent to be examined to try and ascertain whether or not it matched the DNA found on Sally Anne's body. It appeared to be an open and shut case, a lover's tiff that had ended in tragedy. But when the call came from the Forensic Science Service, it was the news that nobody was anticipating. The DNA was a match, but not to Lewis Broston. It matched a disturbing sexual assault cold case from 4 years ago, just 1.5 miles away from where Sally Anne had been brutally murdered. Lewis was released from custody. Following this evidence, the police were now in a race against time to find a killer whose crimes were not only seemingly escalating, but was capable of striking again at any time. The cold case in question was extremely disturbing. Back in a woman was making a call in a telephone box by the car park of a Tesco store. When a man approached her, he proceeded to expose himself and perform a sex act upon himself before leaving his DNA on the floor of the phone box. He then casually walked away across the car park, leaving his terrified victim extremely shaken. Although police had a DNA profile of the attacker, the case soon went cold. Officers who were now working on Sally Anne's case were faced with a horrifying question: if this person had attacked someone in and then murdered a young woman 4 years later, what had he done in the years in between, and how many more victims were there? And since he had now committed a brutal and frenzied murder, where and when would he strike next? It wasn't long before the worst fears of officers were realized. Less than an hour before Sally Anne Bowman was murdered on her doorstep, another woman had been attacked in nearby Sanderstead Road. The woman in question had been standing on the street on her mobile phone when a man came up behind her. All he said was, "I'm sorry," before proceeding to hit her. Officers were convinced that had the offender not been disturbed by a taxi coming down Sanderstead Road, the attack would have escalated. Before running away, he grabbed the victim's mobile phone. The call was still connected, and the person on the other end of the line had heard everything. What is most disturbing is that the screams of the victim did not get quieter, meaning the man who had attacked her and grabbed her phone was hiding nearby, watching what was happening. Thankfully, the taxi driver quickly got her into the car and drove her to hospital. The victim was able to provide a detailed description of the man who had assaulted her, and from this the police were able to issue an e-fit of the man they were looking for. Police believe this was the same man who less than later would go on to murder Sally Anne Bowman. He's described as a white man in his 20s or 30s, between about 5'9" and 6 foot. He's a proportionate build with short dark hair. The e-fit was widely circulated, which led to many calls from the public despite the publicity of the e-fit, and many desperate to help the break officers desperately needed in the case didn't come. The murder squad regrouped and returned to the DNA sample that had been found on Sally Anne Bowman's body. They knew this profile held the key to unlocking the case and catching the man responsible for this disturbing crime spree. Investigators strongly suspected that the killer was local to the area and knew it well. Based on this, police decided to conduct a DNA screening of the area. The task before them was huge. They had addresses to go through, and every single one would need to disclose how many men lived at the property or were staying there the night Sally Anne Bowman was murdered. There were 4,000 men in the South Croydon area that fit the description. They knew the chance of the killer coming forward and offering his DNA was next to none, but they hoped that Maybe a relative, such as a brother or father, might come forward, thus providing that crucial link. Despite the initial promise of the DNA testing center, 6 months after the murder, the investigation was slowing down and officers were running out of options. The people of South Croydon were living in fear, not knowing where the killer would strike next, left them terrified as the investigation was starting to stall. In March, officers decided to change strategy and go back to the e-fit of the man who had attacked a woman less than an hour before Sally Anne was killed. The police were sure that this was the same man who had savagely murdered Sally Anne Bowman. They decided to release another e-fit of the man who had attacked the woman in the phone box 4 years earlier. The man with the same DNA is Sally Anne's killer. The victim from the phone box didn't complete an e-fit in the initial investigation and officers were hopeful she would be able to add more to their investigation, along with the release of the new e-fit after consulting with Sally Anne's family officers, decided it was important for the public to understand the horrific nature of the murder and the level of violence that had been used, and so they held a press conference. People needed to know just how dangerous this man was. Over new leads would come. In following this press conference, they too would go nowhere. However, it wasn't long before the police finally got the break. They were looking 4 miles away in Crawley. A man was in a pub watching the World Cup final between England and Trinidad and Tobago. He had had a significant amount of alcohol and began arguing with another man. There, the argument spilled out onto the street and CCTV caught the scuffle on camera after the man shoved the other to the floor. A nearby police officer intervened, broke up the fight, and the man was arrested. He was soon identified as year-old Mark Dixie, and was taken in for questioning his demeanor during the interview. Was strange, he was described as very tearful and incredibly emotional. Despite the relatively minor nature of the offense, as his custom, his fingerprints and DNA were taken, and he was released on police bail 12 days later. The news that everyone on the murder squad had been hoping for finally arrived. They had had a hit with the DNA from Sally Anne's body. It was a confirmed match for Mark Dixie. The police now had to find Dixie before another woman was attacked. Worryingly, he wasn't in the country. He had fled to the capital city of the Netherlands, Amsterdam, to avoid the manhunt. After 3 months there, he had an argument with his landlord, and so returned to the United Kingdom. He went back to his job as a pub chef when he was arrested for the fight in the streets. He had told the police that the address of the pub was where he was staying, knowing how dangerous he was, and with the environment he worked in, giving him access to knives, officers needed to get him out of the pub kitchen as they were scouting the building to try and find a side entrance mark. Dixie was coming out. Officers quickly apprehended him and brought him into custody. The arresting officer described putting his hand across Dixie's chest to stop him from running away. He said he could feel his heartbeat. His heartbeat never changed, and Dixie remained unusually calm considering the nature of the offense he was being arrested for. The only comment he made when he was being booked into the custody suite was, "I must have been mad to have done that." The following day, Mark Dixie was charged with the murder of Sally Anne Bowman. He remained silent as the charge sheet was read out. The family liaison officer Graham Bannertine called Linda at around p.m. and asked if he could come to the family home. He was finally able to give the devastated Bowman family the news they had waited so long to hear. The man who had viciously taken Sally Anne's life was finally in custody. But who exactly was Mark Dixie, and how had he evaded capture for so long? Born in Stratham, and he had a troubled childhood. His parents divorced when he was months old. His mother remarried, and Dixie took the name Mark James MacDonald using his stepfather's surname, but throughout his life, he would use 5 known aliases, including Mark Philip Dixie, Mark James Down, Stephen MacDonald, and Shane Turner during his childhood. He was also moved to a children's home. He soon developed a long rap sheet with his crimes taking place before it was mandatory to take a DNA sample upon arrest. He robbed a woman at knife point in Stockwell, and he was sentenced to 6 weeks in prison. A year later, he was convicted of robbery, and he received a 2-year sentence for indecent assault and assault occasioning actual bodily harm. He was convicted again of indecent exposure and received a sentence of hours community service. Another conviction came in after he assaulted a police officer, to the horror of investigators. This criminal activity was not limited to the UK. Dixie moved to Australia, but soon ran into trouble. There, he overstayed his visa, and the crime spree started again. A year-old Thai student was alone in her house in Perth when she heard noises coming from her kitchen. After going to investigate, she came face to face with Mark Dixie, who was wearing a stocking pulled over his head. He was also armed with a knife. She was stabbed 7 times and subsequently lost consciousness. He then proceeded to sexually assault her before stealing items from her house and fleeing. Thankfully, she survived the horrifying ordeal. The crimes didn't stop there. On New Year's Day, Dixie had spotted a young woman running along the road near Bunbury, a few hours south of Perth. He stopped his car ahead in the road before taking off his clothes and hiding in a bush. He then jumped out at the woman and asked her to perform a sex act. He received a fine of 3 days later, and in April he was deported from Australia following the formal charge for Sally Anne's murder. The work for investigators was just beginning over the next months. The police painstakingly pieced together Dixie's movements to try and explain how and why he had murdered year-old Sally Anne. They needed the case to be watertight. They spoke to friends and those who knew him and learned that he had been out on the Thaw of September celebrating his birthday the same night he had killed Sally Anne. He went out with friends to a pub on Brighton Road, only a few hundred yards from where Sally Anne had lived, on Blenheim Crescent. Birthdays were very important to Dixie, and previous partners said he always expected something significant on his birthday. That night, his partner hadn't gone out with him while in the pub. He called her, and when he returned to the table, his friends said he was like a completely different person. He was withdrawn, subdued, and clearly angry, and spent the rest of the evening drinking in excess and taking more drugs. When the pub closed, he and 2 female friends left for Avondale Road, where he was going to stay with them. This, too, was only a few hundred yards from Blenheim Crescent. The 2 women headed to bed in the early morning hours, but Mark Dixie didn't. Police believe that he left the property sometime between an a.m. Police also believe he took a knife with him as he left with the intent on finding a woman and attacking her. Investigators strongly suspect he was the person that attacked the woman on Sanderstead Road and was frustrated when he failed to carry out his fantasy after he ran away to nearby Blenheim Crescent. It appeared that Sally Anne Bowman was tragically in the wrong place at the wrong time. Officers theorized that after murdering Sally Anne, he didn't leave the area immediately, but instead hid to see if any neighbors would come out to investigate. No neighbor appeared and no lights in the houses went on. He didn't know, however, that a witness had heard Sally Anne scream and was looking out of her bedroom window while keeping her bedroom light off. Police believe the man she saw walking back in the direction where Sally Anne was found was Mark Dixie. Assuming nobody was watching him, he returned to the body and sexually assaulted her. He then went back to the property he was staying at with his 2 female friends and fell asleep on the sofa. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. During their inquiries, officers reached out to Australian police saying he was in custody and to check if his DNA matched any of the crimes they had on record. It came back with a match to the attack on the Thai student in Perth in the SS on the 3rd of February. Mark Dixie arrived at the Old Bailey Courthouse in London, and his detached and cold demeanor left the courtroom in shock during the trial. The Thai woman from Perth gave evidence that Dixie had stabbed and raped her, and he has yet to be formally charged with this attack, though a DNA sample from her underwear has been matched to him. Dixie's defense was staggering. He admitted to being the rapist and leaving his DNA on Sally Anne's body. He said he had stumbled across what he thought was a drunk girl lying unconscious and took the opportunity to sexually assault her. He said he was not the man who had taken Sally Anne's life, but that the real killer was still out there. He never once offered an explanation for his appalling crimes. Before long, it was time for the jury to deliver their verdict. Mark Dixie was found guilty in a unanimous decision. He received a mandatory life sentence with a minimum term of years. This is among one of the longest minimum terms to ever be given to a single murderer. This also means that before he can even be considered for parole, he will be at least years old. He began his sentence at Belmarsh, a category, a prison, a category. A prison is reserved for highly dangerous offenders that pose great risk to the public. He was then moved to Long Larton Prison after other inmates threatened to attack him at Belmarsh. It was revealed that he had been moved again to another prison. HMP Franklin, this too, was for his own protection. D.C. Chris Lepere, who was part of the murder squad, described him as one of the most frightening people he had ever encountered during his entire career, due to the importance of DNA solving her daughter's case. Linda Bowman is a vocal advocate for a compulsory DNA database. She believes that had DNA not been found, Louis Sproston may have been wrongfully convicted. Stuart Cundy, who led the investigation into Sally Anne Bowman's murder, agreed, saying, "It is my opinion that a national DNA register, with all its appropriate safeguards, could have identified Sally Anne's murderer within hours. Instead, it took nearly 9 months before Mark Dixie was identified." And almost 2.5 years for justice to be done. Their calls for a DNA database were rejected by ministers and other politicians who argued it would be impractical as well as have negative implications for civil liberties. After years of denial in January, Mark Dixie finally confessed to murdering Sally Anne Bowman, and Mark Dixie was charged with yet more offenses, and it was revealed that someone had been wrongfully convicted for some of his depraved crimes. In a Dutch national named Romano van de Dassen was convicted of raping 3 women in the Costa del Sol. He served years in a Spanish prison and was routinely attacked by fellow inmates. Horrifyingly, the real rapist Mark Dixie was a free man in June. A Dutch newspaper reported that Dixie had confessed to one of the sexual assaults, but not the other 2. Romana van der Dusen was eventually acquitted and was present at Southwark Crown Court on November as Mark Dixie was given 2 more life sentences for attacks on 2 other women in Croydon. His crimes went back to when he was just years old. He admitted to raping a woman in the deserted Wandle Road car park, in leaving her bound and gagged as he set her car on fire. According to the judge, she was delighting in her evident fear. He ran away with her credit card details, and later that night he called her home phone to taunt and terrify her. He called again the following evening. The victim was so traumatized she moved to the country to be as isolated as possible. He also confessed to hitting a woman over the head with a Chef Zion and then dragging her to an isolated spot on Selston Road in where he indecently assaulted her. The victim had been leaving messages on her boyfriend's phone as she walked home. But on the last message, she could be heard screaming and dropping the phone. Dixie was only stopped when a concerned neighbor scared him off. He later used the victim's mobile phone that he had taken from the scene to call her boyfriend and brag about what he had done to her. The victim was left with multiple skull fractures. Mark Dixie's cold-hearted and detached manner was evident. He said it could have been worse when Mark Dixie was convicted of these attacks. And Chris Lepere, who had been on the team investigating Sally Anne's murder, said, "I hope today's sentence will bring a small measure of closure to these 2 women. With the advancement in forensic technology, we were able to link Dixie to these offenses and bring him to justice. Although the sentence will never bring their beloved daughter and sister back, the Bowman family were full of admiration for the police, especially their family liaison officer Graham Bannatyne, who gave them invaluable support during the investigation. The damage caused by Mark Dixie is immeasurable. Lives have been shattered, women have lived in fear, an innocent man was wrongfully convicted, and a family are left without their beloved daughter and sister Michelle." The sister of Sally Anne Bowman said, "You get that split in the morning when you wake up and your life is perfect, everything's how you want it to be. And then bang, it's there, and it hits you, worrying to close your eyes, not knowing what you're going to see, not knowing if you're going to see that Sally you remember, or that Sally you see from the pictures. And that fear goes through me every night when I go to sleep. The nightmares don't ever stop. There's not anything in this world that will ever make it better because she will never come back."